Hello everyone, and welcome to the territory of cinema. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Today we are going to discuss the movie The Mummy from 1999. The desert sun beat down on the dusty plains of Egypt, a fitting backdrop for the adventure that was about to unfold. We find Rick O'Connell, a man whose past is as rugged as the terrain he navigates, an American serving in the French Foreign Legion whose fortunes have recently taken a decidedly downward turn after a rather disastrous military engagement. He finds himself in a Cairo jail, a situation one might expect for someone with his particular knack for causing trouble. Yet it is here he meets Evelyn Carnahan. Evelyn, a bright but somewhat clumsy librarian with an almost obsessive passion for Egyptology, is clearly not cut out for the life of adventure she dreams of, though her knowledge is undeniable. Her ambition is tied to her brother, Jonathan, a cheerfully unreliable sort who seems to profit mostly from his sister's endeavors. Evelyn, driven by the desire to prove her theories about the lost city of Hamunaptra, the city of the dead, manages to secure funding and Rick's release, essentially trading his freedom for his services as a guide into the unforgiving sands. Their expedition is fraught with immediate peril. The desert seems determined to swallow them whole, but the allure of the ancient secrets is too strong. They eventually locate the hidden entrance to Hamunaptra, a feat that speaks volumes of Evelyn's research prowess, even if her execution remains delightfully chaotic. Inside the ruins, the team unwittingly awakens something truly ancient and terrible. While exploring the sarcophagus chamber, Evelyn, in typical fashion, reads aloud from a forbidden text, the Book of the Dead. This act instantly unleashes Imhotep, the high priest who betrayed the pharaoh centuries ago, cursed to eternal undeath. Imhotep, once a powerful figure under Seti I, had dared to love Anck-su-namun, the pharaoh's mistress, leading to his gruesome mutilation and entombment alive. Now, resurrected, he seeks to bring Anck-su-namun back to life, absorbing the life force of those around him, including Evelyn, whom he instinctively recognizes as the reincarnation of his lost love. As Imhotep gathers strength, Egypt itself begins to bleed. Plagues sweep across the land. Locusts, the Nile turning to blood, storms that defy nature's logic. Rick, ever the pragmatist, finds himself caught between protecting Evelyn, who feels deeply responsible for the catastrophe, and surviving the growing army of the walking dead Imhotep commands. The tension is palpable. Rick's survival instincts clash with Evelyn's scholarly duty to right her wrong. Jonathan, for his part, mainly tries to avoid getting killed while keeping an eye out for any treasure he can claim along the way. The pursuit takes them across Egypt, pursued by both Imhotep's minions and the surviving members of Evelyn's initial financial backers, who are less interested in preserving history and more interested in securing the gold they believe is buried there. Rick, whose prior service shows a commendable ability to organize and lead under fire, proves an invaluable protector. He and Evelyn develop a genuine fiery chemistry amidst the chaos, their differing worldviews slowly meshing as they face death repeatedly. They realize that the only way to stop the high priest is to use the Book of the Living hidden within Evelyn's inheritance, which can effectively reverse the curse and re-entomb Imhotep. The climax returns them to Hamunaptra, where Imhotep has nearly completed his ritual, his power nearly absolute. Rick fights a desperate battle against the undead high priest, while Evelyn races against time to read the counterspell. Jonathan, surprisingly, plays a crucial role in distracting one of the mummy guards. In a final, breathless sequence, Evelyn successfully reads the necessary incantations. Imhotep crumbles back into dust, the curse broken, and Anck-su-namun's desiccated remains finally find peace. With the danger past and the riches of Hamunaptra secured, though mostly for the museums, much to Jonathan's chagrin, Rick and Evelyn step out of the tomb, forever bound by the extraordinary events they shared. They leave Egypt behind, perhaps ready for a life that involves slightly less desecration of ancient tombs. Though knowing their dynamic, one suspects this grand adventure is just the beginning. The setting was electric with the scent of dry earth and ancient dust, a potent perfume for two souls so mismatched yet so inextricably linked by fate. Rick O'Connell, whose service in the Legion had etched a permanent weariness around his eyes, a look that suggested he'd seen far too many sunrises over battlefields, was a man built for reaction, his every move honed by necessity. He carried himself with a coiled readiness, a stark contrast to Evelyn Carnahan, whose excitement often manifested as physical awkwardness, tripping over invaluable artifacts in her eagerness to catalog them. Her intellect, however, was a gleaming, sharp thing, capable of deciphering hieroglyphs that had baffled established scholars for decades. Jonathan, meanwhile, was pure comic relief, wrapped in slightly ill-fitting tweed, perpetually maneuvering for a better share of the spoils, yet possessing a surprising, if opportunistic, loyalty when genuine danger presented itself. Their initial foray into the ruins was a masterclass in controlled demolition, courtesy of Rick's wartime experience, constantly having to secure areas Evelyn's zeal endangered. The discovery of the hidden chambers felt monumental, a moment where Evelyn's belief in the obscure texts she cherished was vindicated, even as the air grew heavy with a dread she couldn't articulate. When the parchment of the Book of the Dead slipped from her grasp, the sound of its unrolling seemed louder than any desert wind, immediately triggering the dreadful transformation of their petty thieves' escort into shambling horrors. Imhotep's reawakening was less a resurrection, and more an oozing, ancient power asserting itself, his initial appearance as a desiccated husk quickly transitioning to a form of formidable, supernatural malice once he consumed the first life force. The plagues that followed were terrifyingly literal interpretations of biblical warnings, turning the vibrant marketplaces of Cairo into scenes of biblical horror. Watching the Nile bleed crimson under a sky thick with unnatural storms brought home the magnitude of Evelyn's mistake. Her academic curiosity had inadvertently unleashed a force of primordial vengeance. Rick found himself in a role he perhaps secretly craved, the protector of innocence against overwhelming darkness. His easy familiarity with firearms and strategic retreat contrasted sharply with Evelyn's instinct to analyze the mummy's movements as if they were complicated footnotes. There was an undeniable spark ignited by shared peril. Rick admired her sheer tenacity, the way she refused to shrink from the monster she'd helped create, while Evelyn saw past the Legionnaire's cynicism to the core of genuine, if reluctant, heroism. As they fought their way across the landscape, dodging the flesh-hungry servants of the priest, former soldiers and villagers animated by dark magic, the pursuit became a desperate scramble for knowledge. Evelyn's recollection of the Book of the Living, a text she'd initially dismissed as mythology, became their only lifeline. The stakes were personal for her. She was not merely saving Egypt, but redeeming herself. Rick's calm under pressure, skills honed in conflicts far removed from ancient curses, kept their small band alive through ambush after ambush. Jonathan, ever the opportunist, played a key role in securing transport or supplies, usually by abandoning someone else momentarily, but always reappearing when the escape seemed impossible. The final confrontation was inevitably back where it all began, in the suffocating darkness of Hamunaptra. Imhotep, now nearly fully restored by consuming the life force of those who had previously sought the city's treasures, stood as a monumental threat, radiating an aura of impossible power. The climax was a desperate symphony of action and incantation. Rick engaged Imhotep in a brutal physical exchange, relying on sheer grit and his understanding of modern weaponry against supernatural durability, buying Evelyn the vital seconds she needed. Evelyn, clutching the Book of the Living, her voice wavering not from fear, but from the immense concentration required to read the complex counter-magical language, finally managed to voice the final words. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the high priest. As Imhotep dissolved into ash, the air seemed to cleanse itself of centuries of foul magic. The desiccated corpse of Anck-su-namun, finally released from the enchantment, simply turned to dust beside him, a tragic footnote resolved. Emerging into the dawn, the three of them, the weary soldier, the brilliant scholar, and the self-serving brother, were irrevocably changed, survivors of an age-old conflict, their shared secret binding them tighter than any romantic declaration. They carried away not just the promise of historical preservation, but the undeniable proof that some stories are best left unread. The Egyptian dawn, when they finally stumbled back into it, felt blindingly pure after the suffocating gloom of the tomb. Rick, wiping the grit and sweat from his face, carried the unmistakable aura of a man who had just wrestled with something fundamentally outside the laws of physics and won purely through stubbornness and well-aimed bullets. The exhaustion etched onto his frame was testament to a career spent constantly anticipating the next threat, whether it came from a firing squad or an enraged mummy. For Evelyn, emerging felt like an exorcism. The weight of the catastrophic mistake she'd made, the reading of the curse, was slowly lifting, replaced by the profound satisfaction of having corrected an error of cosmic proportions. Her posture straightened, the timid academic veneer finally cracking to reveal the determined explorer underneath, capable of facing down death armed with only a book. Jonathan, ever concerned with the practicalities of survival, was already haggling with the few remaining guards, trying to secure a fair price for their passage out of the dangerous vicinity, his moral compass perpetually spinning toward profit. He had, surprisingly, managed to keep the priceless artifacts relatively safe, mostly because he was too terrified of Imhotep to get near them until the danger had definitively passed. His momentary bravery in distracting a pursuing undead warrior near the central pillar was quickly filed away under lucky accidents in his personal ledger. The bond forged between Rick and Evelyn deepened in the silence that followed the collapse of the ancient evil. It was a connection built not on polite conversation or shared hobbies, but on the visceral reality of saving each other's lives multiple times within a 24-hour period. Rick looked at Evelyn not just as the cause of the disaster, but as the only person capable of wielding the esoteric knowledge necessary to end it. He saw the steel beneath the librarian's spectacles. Conversely, Evelyn saw the quiet nobility in Rick, the man who fought not for glory or gold, but because someone needed protecting. His cynicism, she realized, was merely scar tissue protecting a fierce sense of responsibility. As they rode away from the now-sealed necropolis, the desert landscape seemed suddenly less menacing, imbued with the knowledge that its secrets, though dangerous, were now safely contained. The lingering fear was replaced by a shared, almost giddy disbelief. They had faced the impossible. Rick, leaning back, the familiar weight of his sidearm a comfort, found himself anticipating a future that included less Legion duty and perhaps more of Evelyn's lively, if chaotic, company. He realized the pursuit of history, guided by Evelyn, might be more compelling than any skirmish he'd ever fought. They left the Valley of the Kings behind, taking with them not just scrolls and gold, but a potent, unforgettable shared history, a promise whispered on the desert wind that their extraordinary partnership was only just finding its true footing outside the pages of an ancient curse. Their return to civilization, specifically the bustling, somewhat corrupt heart of Cairo, was jarring. The familiar smells of spices and sewage replaced the dry sterility of the tomb, forcing them back into the constraints of the mundane world they had so violently interrupted. Rick, a man who thrived in the gray areas of survival, found the paperwork and polite society that inevitably followed their miraculous return almost more taxing than fighting a legion of mummies. He was constantly under scrutiny, a former legionnaire, a hero of dubious standing, now entangled with an Englishwoman of means and questionable organizational skills. Evelyn, suddenly famous in esoteric circles, struggled with the attention. Her triumph was mixed with the grave realization of how close she had come to damning an entire country. She spent hours poring over her recovered notes, not just in triumph, but in quiet penance, documenting every aspect of the events, striving to bring academic rigor to the chaos they had witnessed. Her relationship with Jonathan became strained. He viewed the legitimate archaeological finds as a temporary inconvenience before they could liquidate their assets, while Evelyn insisted on proper preservation. Jonathan, however, found himself unexpectedly useful in managing the sudden influx of attention and guarding their temporary safe house from overly curious treasure hunters who suspected they had found something far greater than the myths suggested. Rick, feeling the pull of a life beyond constant flight, found himself drawn into Evelyn's new reality, however uncomfortable. He watched her interact with other scholars, the subtle shift in her confidence evident to him, a confidence earned not in lecture halls, but in the face of ancient, suffocating evil. One evening, as they reviewed maps detailing the location of a small, unlooted tomb they had marked during their initial frantic escape, a private venture, distinct from the official recovery efforts, the air between them crackled. It wasn't the supernatural energy of Imhotep, but the slow, inevitable recognition between two people who had seen the worst and best of each other under extreme duress. Rick, whose career path had offered little room for attachment, found himself investing an astonishing amount of energy into ensuring Evelyn's next academic pursuit didn't end in accidental worldwide apocalypse. The quiet understanding, built upon shared adrenaline and mutual respect for competence, his in combat, hers in knowledge, began to settle into something warmer, something resembling a future that didn't require them to constantly look over their shoulders for pursuing supernatural forces, though knowing their luck, such peace was likely temporary. Their attempts to settle into a semblance of normalcy proved comically short-lived, as if the sands of Egypt had cursed their very attempts at domesticity. Rick, despite his growing affection for Evelyn, found the staid drawing rooms of Cairo society suffocating. He was a man accustomed to the direct communication of a firefight. He found the veiled judgments and polite inquiries about his past service painfully artificial. He often retreated to the dusty back rooms of the archives Evelyn now frequented, cleaning his sidearm or studying the maps, finding more comfort in the familiar weight of a weapon than in a teacup. He carried the weight of their shared secret, a constant vigilance that made him restless, forever anticipating the next shadow that wasn't just a shadow. Evelyn, on the other hand, was energized, though chastened. Her intellectual curiosity, once viewed by her peers as eccentric obsession, was now validated by empirical, albeit horrifying, evidence. Yet the scholarly recognition felt thin compared to the visceral feeling of having stared down primordial death. She developed a habit of touching the pages of the recovered Book of the Living, now safely locked away under heavy guard, as if reassuring herself it was truly inert. Her relationship with Jonathan became increasingly fraught. His eagerness to sell off minor treasures felt like a betrayal of the historical reverence she now held so fiercely. She saw in him the very greed that had almost doomed them all, a constant reminder of the base motivations that often accompanied grand discovery. The undercurrent of attraction between Evelyn and Rick began to assert itself in small, undeniable ways. A shared glance across a room full of skeptical Egyptologists would convey volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the otherworldly crucible they had passed through together. Rick, usually reserved to the point of stoicism, found himself offering small, protective gestures, ensuring her carriage was well guarded, testing the locks on her study door, even offering surprisingly astute commentary on the provenance of a newly acquired, less cursed artifact. It was a courtship conducted in the language of preparedness and mutual survival. One afternoon, while examining a shipment of recently recovered items, Evelyn discovered a small, intact funerary mask that bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Anck-su-namun before her curse. The sight momentarily drained the color from her face. Rick, noticing her distress before anyone else, quietly stepped beside her, placing a steadying, non-intrusive hand near her shoulder, not quite touching, but offering solid presence. In that moment, the vast gulf between the hardened soldier and the dreamy scholar closed completely. They understood that their adventure wasn't just a story to be catalogued, it was the foundational bedrock of their future, a truth so intense it couldn't be contained by polite society. They knew, with the certainty born of near-death experiences, that while they had sealed away Imhotep, true adventure, and perhaps true love, was something they were now cursed or blessed to pursue together. The world was full of dusty corners and forgotten texts, and Rick O'Connell, for the first time in his life, was eager to explore them, provided Evelyn was there to read the maps. Their lingering presence in Cairo eventually became untenable. The official recovery efforts, managed by stern-faced academics and government officials, demanded more accountability than Rick was willing to provide. He was not a man suited to endless committee meetings about provenance and the proper cataloging of cursed relics. He was an instrument of action, now being forced into the role of a reluctant celebrity whose primary qualification was surviving the unspeakable. Evelyn, increasingly uncomfortable with the bureaucratic dissection of their trauma, found herself aligning more and more with Rick's desire to simply leave the suffocating structures of established archaeology behind. Jonathan, predictably, was the catalyst for their next departure. Having managed to squirrel away a few particularly valuable, though perhaps less magically significant, pieces from the ruins, items he was convinced would fetch a handsome price in London without alerting the authorities to their full haul, he decided Cairo was becoming too hot. He subtly planted the idea of a fresh pursuit. A rumor of an undiscovered tomb hinted at in one of Evelyn's more obscure texts, a place far removed from the scrutiny of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. It was a flimsy excuse, but one that perfectly masked the real reason they needed to leave, the deepening unspoken commitment between Rick and Evelyn. As they prepared their hasty exit, Evelyn felt a profound sense of liberation. She was shedding the expectations placed upon her by her conservative upbringing and her brother's opportunism. With Rick, she didn't need to prove her worth. Her worth had been forged in fire and plague. Rick, watching her pack her traveling clothes, less formal attire, more practical gear, recognized the shift. The librarian was fading, replaced by a companion whose eyes held the same weary, knowing spark as his own. He was trading the structured chaos of the Legion for the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of a life with Evelyn Carnahan. Their journey out was discreet, fueled by Rick's old survivalist instincts and Jonathan's surprisingly effective network of shady contacts for securing passage. As the ship pulled away from the docks, leaving the familiar, heavy skyline of Cairo behind them, Evelyn stood at the railing next to Rick. The tension between them had melted into an easy, solid companionship. He didn't need to say much. A shared look conveyed volumes about the dangers they had overcome and the unknown territories awaiting them. Rick O'Connell, the mercenary, had found something worth more than gold, a purpose anchored not in foreign wars, but in protecting the brilliant, slightly disastrous woman beside him. And Evelyn, the scholar, had finally discovered the greatest, most thrilling text of all, the unpredictable, dangerous, and utterly captivating story written in the presence of the man who had saved her life repeatedly. They looked toward the horizon, not necessarily seeking the next mummy, but ready together for whatever ancient secret the world chose to throw in their path next. The voyage across the Mediterranean was a study in quiet contentment, a necessary decompression after the sustained, high-octane terror of their Egyptian escapade. For Rick, the rocking of the ship was a soothing monotony, a vast, empty space far removed from the claustrophobic confines of tombs and the oppressive heat of the desert. He spent his days maintaining their small cache of essential gear, his movements economical and precise, while Evelyn occupied herself with translating ancillary texts recovered from the lower levels of Hamunaptra. material deemed too dry or politically sensitive for the official recovery teams back in Cairo. Jonathan, naturally, was confined mostly to his cabin, meticulously polishing a set of minor amulets, fearful that the slightest tremor might cause them to slip from his grasp and reveal themselves as less than legitimate acquisitions. Evelyn found a new depth to her scholarship, realizing that the true understanding of ancient Egypt lay not just in the grand curses, but in the subtle cultural nuances she now had the context to appreciate. She often sought Rick out during his solitary hours on deck, not for academic debate, but simply for his grounding presence. Their conversations were less about life and death now, and more about establishing a shared vocabulary for their future. She'd ask about his Legion days, not the battles, but the logistics, the quiet skills of desert navigation that he possessed instinctively. Rick, in turn, learned to interpret the subtle shifts in Evelyn's expression when a translation proved particularly vexing or exhilarating, realizing her quiet moments were often just as intense as her bursts of clumsy energy. The slow burn romance deepened in these shared silences. One evening, under a sky impossibly vast and sprinkled with unfamiliar constellations, Evelyn mentioned a planned lecture series she was expected to give in London, detailing the historical significance of the artifacts they had handled. A shadow crossed Rick's face, the familiar tension returning. He wasn't built for the spotlight, especially one shining on the very events he felt responsible for initiating. Evelyn noticed instantly. She turned to him, her expression earnest, her voice soft. She didn't offer empty reassurances about fame. Instead, she spoke of the necessity of control, of controlling the narrative, ensuring the truth of what they experienced wasn't distorted by fearful bureaucrats. She was asking him, tacitly, to stand beside her, not just as a hired guard, but as an equal partner in the guardianship of that truth. Rick's response was simply to take her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping securely around hers, a silent contract signed beneath the indifferent stars. He was realizing that protecting Evelyn, whether from a mummy or from the stifling judgment of the British academic elite, was now the only mission that truly mattered to him. They were sailing toward a different kind of danger, one measured not in plagues, but in propriety and expectation, a challenge he felt strangely prepared to meet, simply because he wouldn't be facing it alone. London, upon their arrival, presented a chilling contrast to the sun-drenched expanse of Egypt. The air was damp, heavy with coal smoke, and the perpetual gray light seemed intent on smothering any lingering vestiges of desert vitality. For Rick, stepping onto English soil felt like stepping into a cage. The formality of the docks, the sharp-eyed constables, and the sheer density of structured society pressed in on him. He felt conspicuously large, too armed in spirit if not always in fact, constantly scanning the faces in the crowd for any hint of official scrutiny, or worse, the arrival of an overly zealous treasure hunter sniffing around Evelyn's newly acquired academic prestige. Evelyn, however, thrived momentarily in the structured chaos of intellectual life. Her lecture debut was a sensation. She spoke with a quiet, almost fierce authority, weaving the archaeological evidence with the terrifying reality of their encounter, carefully omitting the most overtly supernatural details while still conveying the immense gravity of Imhotep's threat. The academic world buzzed. They saw a brilliant mind redeemed, though many suspected her account was embellished for dramatic effect. It was during these engagements that Rick often lingered at the back of the hall, a silent, imposing sentinel. He didn't understand the nuances of historical dating, but he understood when Evelyn's eyes darkened with true memory, and he would subtly adjust his posture, a silent promise that he was ready to clear the room if necessary. Jonathan, surprisingly, adapted best to the metropolitan environment. London offered far more complex opportunities for discreet profiteering than Cairo. He quickly established himself as Evelyn's agent, handling the delicate business of securing endowments and selling off minor, non-magical Egyptian acquisitions to fund Evelyn's continued research. and his own increasingly lavish lifestyle. He maintained a facade of devoted brotherly concern, often loudly admonishing Evelyn for overworking herself while secretly securing a new velvet smoking jacket. The true comfort for Rick and Evelyn remained their stolen moments away from the scrutiny. They rented a small, slightly ramshackle house far from the grand estates Evelyn's status might suggest. Here the formality dissolved. Rick would teach Evelyn rudimentary field survival skills, how to tie a complex knot, how to read a compass without relying on magnetism, skills utterly divorced from the drawing room politics they navigated daily. Evelyn, in turn, would introduce him to literature that sparked his imagination beyond military strategy, finding a surprising appreciation in him for tales of exploration and high adventure, albeit stories that, thankfully, didn't involve reanimated priests. Their intimacy grew from shared competency. One afternoon, while attempting to repair a faulty latch on their attic storage, a purely domestic, low-stakes problem, their hands brushed. The spark was immediate and profound, a recognition that their connection was rooted not in shared background or social standing, but in the shared experience of battling the absolute boundary of human understanding. Rick looked at her, seeing past the meticulous braid and the respectable woolen dress to the woman who had willingly read the words that summoned Armageddon. He leaned in, the hesitation born of his rough past finally overcome by the certainty of her presence. The kiss was tentative at first, then deeply felt, a tangible anchor securing them both against the tides of the extraordinary past and the unpredictable future. They had survived the dead. Now they were tentatively beginning to navigate the complications of the living. Their newfound domesticity, however carefully constructed in their discreet London refuge, felt inherently temporary, like an exquisitely constructed sandcastle just beyond the reach of the tide. Both Rick and Evelyn possessed an intrinsic understanding that their lives were calibrated to a higher level of risk than their contemporaries. They were survivors of a secret war, and secrets, especially ones involving the complete annihilation of a high priest, rarely stay buried. The stability began to fray at the edges when a package arrived, addressed simply to Evelyn, bearing a seal unfamiliar yet disturbingly reminiscent of the markings they'd seen deep within Hamunaptra's outer chambers. It contained not gold or another curse, but an official summons from a clandestine section of the British Museum, hinting at inconsistencies in the official inventory of recovered Egyptian goods. A thinly veiled accusation, Evelyn knew, aimed at those who had bypassed conventional channels. Jonathan, who had been conspicuously absent for a week on a business trip involving the discreet sale of a slightly tarnished bronze dagger, suddenly reappeared, pale and agitated, confirming their fears. His minor profiteering had attracted unwanted official attention. Rick reacted with the precision of a man anticipating an ambush. He immediately began fortifying their small residence, not with sandbags, but with contingency plans, mapping out escape routes through London's winding back alleys, routes only a man who understood the necessity of flight could devise. He viewed the British authorities with the same weary distrust he reserved for corrupt Legion officers, powerful, predictable, and dangerously lacking in imagination regarding the true scope of ancient threats. Evelyn, facing the possibility of losing control over the narrative again, felt a surge of familiar defiance. She was no longer the timid scholar. She was the woman who had stared down Imhotep. She argued passionately with Rick, insisting they couldn't simply flee this time. They had a duty to protect the legitimate historical record from both their own impulsive actions and the clumsy handling of the museum's bureaucracy. Their argument was intense, fueled by the deep well of stress they both carried. It was a clash not of affection, but of operational philosophy. Rick demanding immediate tactical withdrawal, Evelyn insisting on strategic defense of their integrity. It was Jonathan, ironically, who provided the necessary bridge. He confessed, with uncharacteristic sincerity, that he had overheard chatter in the antiquarian black market about other similar anomalies, Other expeditions that might have inadvertently disturbed resting ancient powers, perhaps even others awakening from similar curses. He presented a fragmented map, purportedly pointing toward a rumored sister tomb to Hamunaptra, one purportedly housing not a priest but perhaps a tool capable of neutralizing such forces, rather than merely re-entombing them. For Rick, the allure of preemptive action, of heading off a potential second cataclysm before the academics even recognized the first, was irresistible. For Evelyn, the chance to study a power source that could control the forbidden texts was the ultimate scholarly challenge. The decision was made not over tea and polite conversation, but in the tense silence of a dimly lit study framed by the necessity of proactive survival. They would leave London, following the next whisper of forgotten power. United once more by the irresistible call of the unknown, Rick's hand already reaching for his travel-worn satchel. The decision to abandon the tenuous comfort of London for another unknown pursuit felt less like a choice, and more like a gravitational pull exerted by their shared history. Jonathan, energized by the prospect of international travel and the potential for acquiring artifacts completely outside the purview of any legitimate government, became their unlikely logistics expert. He moved through the city's less savory circles with surprising agility, securing passage on a tramp steamer heading vaguely east, far from the well-patrolled maritime routes favored by official vessels. Rick, ever the realist, viewed the potential sister tomb not as an opportunity for glory, but as an urgent ticking clock. If Imhotep's awakening was a symptom of a broader, systemic instability within the Egyptian necropolis network, then they were the only ones with the unpleasant first-hand knowledge required to intervene before another city succumbed to plague and undeath. He spent their final days in the relative safety of the city, acquiring specialized climbing gear and high-altitude supplies, his purchases raising eyebrows even in the city's seedier corners, which only served to reinforce his commitment to extreme stealth. Evelyn immersed herself in the fragmented map Jonathan had procured. It was rendered on brittle papyrus overlaid with what appeared to be astrological notations far more complex than the texts related to Imhotep. She felt a profound sense of responsibility. Her initial academic curiosity had evolved into a sacred duty to manage these ancient forces. In moments of quiet reflection, she recognized that the thrill of the chase, the pure, unadulterated pursuit of knowledge, was now inextricably linked to Rick. She found herself mapping out their future not just in terms of tombs and historical breakthroughs, but in shared quiet evenings, picturing him reading by the light of a flickering lantern in some remote corner of the world. Their farewell to London was as abrupt as their arrival had been tumultuous. They slipped away under the cover of a thick, natural fog, a welcome atmospheric ally that seemed to sympathize with their need for secrecy. As the steamer chugged away from the English coast, heading into the uncertain gray expanse of the open water, the dynamic between the three was starkly defined. Jonathan was already sketching out potential auction prices in his head. Evelyn was lost in the symbols on the map, her brow furrowed in concentration, and Rick stood guard at the stern, watching the receding shoreline with an expression of grim satisfaction. He was happiest when the world was large, dangerous, and required his full attention. He understood now that his greatest skill wasn't surviving the Legion, but surviving with Evelyn. Her brilliance was the compass, and his resolve was the engine that kept them moving toward the next inevitable confrontation, forever drawn into the wake of things that should have remained eternally buried. The steamer cut a slow, purposeful path across the churning gray sea, its rhythmic groan a counterpoint to the nervous energy vibrating within the small group. The sea voyage provided a necessary crucible for Evelyn to further decipher the cryptic map, which seemed to indicate their next destination lay somewhere deep in the rugged interior of Asia Minor, a region historically less explored by mainstream Western Egyptologists, lending credence to Jonathan's rumor about an untainted find. Evelyn traced a series of converging lines on the brittle parchment, noting the celestial alignment referenced was one that occurred only once every few centuries, suggesting the tomb's placement was tied to a highly specific, rare astronomical event, a detail that spoke to the sheer, meticulous power of the civilization that built it. Rick, utilizing the steamer's cramped, relatively empty hold as a makeshift training area, focused on refining his close-quarters combat skills, adapting the Legion's drills to the unpredictable pitching of the deck. He found an unexpected audience in Jonathan, who, despite his inherent cowardice, possessed a keen, if self-serving, observational eye. Jonathan didn't learn to fight, but he learned which angles to avoid when a sudden lurch sent heavy crates skittering, knowledge that might prove invaluable when dodging falling debris in an unstable ruin. Rick tolerated Jonathan's presence because he understood that the man's petty greed, however annoying, was a reliable mechanism for securing necessary supplies and navigating the underworld of international artifact trade, something Rick himself disdained to touch. The unspoken dialogue between Rick and Evelyn continued to deepen, evolving past simple survival tactics. On deck during a brief lull in the weather, Evelyn confessed to Rick that the fear of history repeating itself was almost as strong as her desire to uncover more of it. She spoke of the terrifying realization that the pursuit of knowledge, when untethered from wisdom, was sheer arrogance. Rick listened, his usual terse responses giving way to long silences where his gaze never left her face. He saw in her not just the brilliant mind, but the fierce, self-sacrificing heart that had read the curse aloud to save her brother. He found himself wanting to build a life with her that was entirely separate from curses and tombs, a life of simple domesticity. But the weight of their shared secret made such a desire feel dangerously naive. Their destination, when they finally disembarked at a grimy, bustling port city far from conventional travel hubs, was a world away from Cairo's colonial elegance or London's damp conformity. The air here was sharp, smelling of pine and cold stone, indicative of the mountainous terrain ahead. The map led them away from established roads, forcing them to rely on a team of local guides Jonathan had managed to hire, men whose skepticism regarding the foreigners' true objective was palpable. As they prepared their land ascent, Evelyn secured a protective amulet she had secretly commissioned in London based on a design she found in the periphery of Imhotep's burial chamber, a small insurance policy against purely magical threats. Rick merely checked the loads of his rifles, understanding that against unknown, ancient powers, faith in meticulous preparation was his only true amulet. They moved forward, a trio reluctantly united by the trail of forgotten empires, driven now not by accident, but by a shared, almost obsessive need to understand and contain the forces they had inadvertently set loose upon the world. The ascent into the jagged, forgotten highlands was grueling, a stark reminder that the world held vast expanses where modern civilization had only thinly scraped the surface. The air thinned with every upward climb, forcing even Rick, the picture of hardened stamina, to take measured breaths. The local guides, tough men accustomed to the unforgiving terrain, moved with a quiet professionalism that contrasted sharply with Jonathan's constant wheezing complaints. Jonathan, draped in layers of impractical tweed despite the increasing altitude, treated every incline as a personal affront, dramatically pausing to sip weak tea from a thermos while muttering darkly about the absurdity of seeking out a dusty hole in the ground, when there were perfectly good, well-lit banks in any major European city. Evelyn, however, moved with a focused energy that belied the physical exertion. She was constantly consulting the map, her fingers tracing the lines with a near-reverent intensity. The symbols, she had concluded, were not purely astrological, but represented a highly advanced form of geomancy, linking the tomb's resting place to specific tectonic or energetic fault lines. She felt a growing sense of awe, mixed with the cold dread that perhaps this second site was not a sister tomb, but an anchor, a place deliberately established to regulate the immense energies unleashed by the first. Her intellectual excitement manifested in sharp, precise questions directed at Rick, probing his understanding of cover and evasion in mountainous terrain, blending her theoretical knowledge with his practical application. Rick, leading the way, moved with the deceptive quietness of a predator, his eyes constantly assessing the ridgelines. He noticed the subtle shift in Evelyn's demeanor. She was no longer flustered by the danger. She embraced the intellectual problem it presented. This transformation was the bedrock of his unwavering commitment. He respected the fearlessness that emerged when she was intellectually engaged, a fearlessness far more potent than the bravado displayed by many of the soldiers he'd served alongside. When they stopped for their midday rest beside a crumbling, wind-worn monolith etched with symbols they couldn't decipher, Rick took a moment not to scan for threats, but to watch Evelyn sketch rapidly in her notebook. He saw the future in those sketches, a future that demanded constant movement, yes, but one that also promised genuine partnership. The protective amulet Evelyn wore, a piece of dull metal hanging beneath her tunic, occasionally caught the light. Rick observed it without comment, understanding it was her modern acknowledgement of the supernatural reality they faced. He preferred the tangible reassurance of his rifles, but he recognized the symbolic need for her faith. Their progress was abruptly halted near dusk when their lead guide froze, raising a hand. Not 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by a sudden, localized swirl of unnatural mist, the air growing suddenly cold despite the day's climb, was a crude stone marker, clearly placed by human hands centuries ago, yet emanating the same faint, unsettling hum that preceded Imhotep's return. It wasn't the final destination, but a warning post. Rick instantly dropped into a defensive crouch, leveling his rifle, his earlier exhaustion vanishing, replaced by the ice-cold clarity of imminent engagement. Jonathan let out a strangled yelp and instantly dove behind the nearest stable-looking rock, forgetting his sore knees in favor of self-preservation. Evelyn, however, moved toward the marker, driven by an impulse stronger than caution. "Rick!" she whispered, her voice taut with urgency. "This isn't just a marker. It's a seal, and I think something just broke it." The air around the stone began to shimmer, hinting that their detour into quiet academia was officially over. The ancient forces, sensing their proximity, were once again stirring. The 1999 cinematic venture, The Mummy, masterfully blends swashbuckling adventure with supernatural horror, achieving a tone that feels both reverent to classic Hollywood adventure serials and refreshingly modern for its time. Stephen Sommers, the director, clearly drew deep inspiration from Universal's original monster movies, particularly the Boris Karloff iteration of The Mummy, yet infused the narrative with a faster pace and a distinct Indiana Jones-esque spirit of treasure hunting. This balancing act between homage and reinvention is central to the film's enduring appeal. Brendan Fraser's portrayal of Rick O'Connell is a pivotal element in anchoring the film's tone. Fraser, fresh off successes in films like George of the Jungle and navigating a transition toward more serious roles, brings an effortless, roguish charm to the mercenary-turned-reluctant hero. O'Connell is not a learned archaeologist. He is a man of action, driven by instinct and survival, making him an immediately accessible protagonist for a broad audience. His dynamic with Evelyn Carnahan, portrayed by Rachel Weisz, forms the intellectual and romantic backbone of the story. Rachel Weisz's Evelyn is perhaps the film's most compelling surprise. She embodies the classic, spunky librarian archetype, but imbued with a genuine, almost reckless scholarly passion. Weisz's commitment to the character's earnest pursuit of ancient Egyptian history provides the necessary narrative drive to awaken Imhotep. Her career at this point was marked by critically acclaimed roles in films like Sense and Sensibility, suggesting a capability for nuanced performance, which she expertly channels here into humorous exasperation and fierce intelligence when confronted with the undead reality of her discoveries. The juxtaposition of her meticulous, book-learned approach against O'Connell's pragmatic fighting skill creates immediate, watchable chemistry. The antagonist, Imhotep, brought to life through the performance capture and vocal work of Arnold Vosloo, serves as a fantastic engine for the plot's escalation. Vosloo leans into the tragedy inherent in the curse. A man driven by forbidden love and eternal punishment, his initial appearance is more ghostly and ethereal, gradually building into a monstrous force as he regains his physical strength by consuming the life force of mortals. The visual effects used to depict Imhotep, particularly the sand-based transformations, were groundbreaking for 1999 and remain remarkably effective due to the practical weight given to the character's motivations. The narrative structure cleverly uses the disparate skill sets of the ensemble cast. Jonathan Carnahan, Evelyn's slightly feckless but loyal brother, played by John Hannah, offers much of the necessary comic relief, operating as the audience surrogate who often reacts with appropriate panic to the unfolding supernatural terror. This layering of distinct character types allows the film to transition seamlessly between globe-trotting action sequences, like the initial discovery in Hamunaptra, and claustrophobic horror set pieces within the ancient city. The score by Jerry Goldsmith is indispensable to the film's success, weaving majestic, sweeping orchestral arrangements during the chase scenes with ominous, percussive motifs that signal Imhotep's growing power. Goldsmith, a veteran composer known for scores ranging from Planet of the Apes to Alien, understood how to underscore high adventure without overwhelming the visual spectacle. Ultimately, The Mummy succeeds because it never takes itself too seriously while still respecting the stakes of its mythology. It functions as a magnificent piece of escapism, recognizing that the most satisfying adventure stories are those where heroism is born out of necessity rather than entitlement, and where the bond formed between unlikely companions is strong enough to face eternal damnation and win. The film's pacing, its commitment to practical feeling effects even when utilizing burgeoning CGI technology, and the magnetic interplay between Fraser and Weisz solidify its status as a benchmark for modern action-adventure filmmaking. The sheer spectacle of Hamunaptra, the City of the Dead, is not merely a set piece. It functions as a character in itself, a physical manifestation of forbidden knowledge and deadly consequence. Summers and his production team clearly understood the visual vocabulary required to sell an ancient Egyptian horror story to a mass audience accustomed to slicker, more sterile special effects. The grime, the dust, and the overwhelming scale of the ruins convey a sense of genuine antiquity and danger that perfectly sets the stage for the film's central conflict. When the scarab beetles begin to swarm, or when Imhotep's mummified form first cracks open, the film manages to evoke genuine physical revulsion alongside the thrill of discovery, a feeling often lost in CGI-heavy blockbusters that followed. O'Connell's internal conflict, though superficially simple, get the money, survive, is deeply tied to his relationship with Evelyn. He is the grounded man forced to contend with a reality that defies all logic he has built his survival upon. Fraser plays this transition beautifully. His initial weariness transforms into protective ferocity as Evelyn puts herself in increasing peril. There is a genuine sense of weary honor about O'Connell. He is not seeking glory, but rather the simple comfort of a life not spent dodging bullets in far-flung locales, a sentiment made more potent by the hints of his past in the French Foreign Legion. Evelyn, meanwhile, is continuously oscillating between the thrill of academic validation and the sheer terror of facing the historical impossibility she has unleashed. Her early scenes in the library of Beni Hassan are suffused with a quiet, almost nervous energy, the passion of a scholar on the cusp of a world-altering discovery. When she reads the Book of the Dead aloud, it is less an act of malice and more an act of overwhelming, intoxicating intellectual hubris. Weisz ensures that even when Evelyn is screaming or cowering, the underlying intelligence that drove her to that fateful moment remains palpable. This intelligence is what ultimately allows her to decipher the means of stopping Imhotep, repositioning her from catalyst of disaster to essential savior. The supporting players, particularly Ardeth Bey, played by Oded Fehr, provide crucial exposition and mythic weight without bogging down the pacing. Fehr embodies the stoic, ancient guardian archetype, radiating silent disappointment in humanity's inability to learn from history. His loyalty to his duty, a centuries-old vow, offers a moral counterpoint to the mercenary motivations of O'Connell and the greed of the American treasure hunters who inadvertently awaken Imhotep. Ardeth Bey's presence serves as a constant, somber reminder that the adventure is not just a game of archaeological retrieval, but a deadly struggle between cosmic forces. The decision to make Imhotep an inherently tragic figure, a high priest whose crimes stemmed from passionate, albeit illicit, love, adds layers to the horror. He is not just a mindless monster, he is a vengeful spirit seeking reunion, making his pursuit of Evelyn, who bears a resemblance to his lost Anck-su-namun, deeply personal. This entanglement of romance and revenge elevates the action beyond simple monster slaying, grounding the supernatural threat in recognizable human failing, albeit magnified to an epic scale. The film skillfully uses this emotional core to justify the escalating body count and the escalating magical attacks, maintaining a heightened sense of emotional urgency throughout the final act. The underlying tone of genuine peril is expertly managed through the recurring theme of corruption and biblical plagues unleashed upon the modern world. When Imhotep begins to manifest his full power, the ensuing plagues, the flesh-eating scarabs, the deluge of water, the swarms of locusts, are depicted with a visceral impact that harkens back to classic biblical epics, blending historical awe with genuine body horror. This reliance on tangible, if magically induced, threats grounds the fantastical elements. Even the skeletal warriors summoned by Imhotep, while clearly CGI creations, move with a jerky, unholy momentum that makes them feel like animated ancient relics, rather than slick digital creations. Jonathan Carnahan, despite his less heroic bearing, provides necessary emotional release. John Hannah manages to infuse his cowardice with genuine familial affection for his sister. His moments of ineptitude, such as his brief stint accidentally becoming the caretaker of the children, serve to deflate the mounting tension just long enough for the audience to catch their breath before the next wave of terror hits. He represents the ordinary man swept up in extraordinary circumstances, amplifying the stakes for the true protagonists. The film's visual palette often contrasts the blinding sun-scorched sands of Egypt with the dark, enclosed spaces of the tombs and ancient chambers. This contrast mirrors the internal battle within the characters, the bright world of tangible discovery versus the dark abyss of the occult they are forced to confront. Rick O'Connell, the man who thrives in the light and dust of open conflict, finds himself increasingly reliant on Evelyn's ability to navigate the darkness of ancient lore. Their reliance on one another shifts from a simple partnership of convenience to a deeply ingrained trust, forged in shared near-death experiences. Evelyn's transformation throughout the movie is subtle but significant. She moves from the slightly clumsy, overeager academic whose mistakes endanger everyone, to the decisive intellectual powerhouse who understands the language of the curse better than anyone. Her moment of realization concerning the counterspell is played not with boastful triumph, but with desperate urgency, highlighting the emotional toll of bearing such grave responsibility. She understands that her intellectual curiosity has very nearly cost the world its safety, fueling her subsequent drive to fix the catastrophic error. Moreover, the film exhibits a wonderful understanding of mythological symmetry. Imhotep is repeatedly referred to as the High Priest, underscoring the religious and political gravity of his original crime, desecrating the eternal resting place for a mortal liaison. This isn't just a random monster. It is a catastrophic failure of faith and duty, magnified by centuries of supernatural imprisonment. His very existence challenges the established order of the afterlife, making his defeat feel like the necessary reassertion of universal balance, a theme common in grand adventure narratives where order must be restored after chaos is introduced by overreaching ambition. The whole production revels in this grand, sweeping sense of mythological consequence. The success of The Mummy in establishing its specific brand of supernatural adventure owes much to its deliberate pacing, which allows for moments of quiet dread to punctuate the high-octane action sequences. Unlike later sequels or films that favored non-stop spectacle, Summers understands the essential grammar of suspense developed in classic monster movies. The build-up is as important as the payoff. Consider the sequence where the expedition members first encounter the effects of Imhotep's awakening, the silent decomposition of the treasure hunters, or the gradual realization that the mummies accompanying Imhotep are not merely props but active, terrifying threats. These moments rely heavily on sound design and sustained tension rather than immediate visual shock, allowing the audience to process the impossibility of the situation alongside the characters. Rick O'Connell's inherent physical competence is frequently tested not just by physical opponents, but by logistical nightmares inherent in navigating the ancient, crumbling city. He is often relegated to purely defensive maneuvers, protecting Evelyn and Jonathan while they decipher the next crucial piece of lore or secure the necessary artifact. This dynamic cleverly sidesteps the trope of the omnipotent hero. O'Connell is excellent with a gun and a fist, but useless against an ancient curse written in hieroglyphs. His heroism is defined by his dedication to protecting the vulnerable, a very human quality that contrasts sharply with Imhotep's cold, self-serving magical power. Rachel Weisz's portrayal ensures Evelyn never devolves into the damsel in distress trope, even when she is in mortal danger. Her moments of rescue are invariably followed by her actively contributing to the solution, whether by identifying a crucial weakness in Imhotep's power structure or by locating the specific text needed for the final confrontation. This intellectual partnership with O'Connell creates a synergy where brute force and academic insight are equally valued components of survival. Their burgeoning romance feels earned precisely because they rely on each other's core strengths to navigate impossible odds, rather than relying on superficial attraction. Furthermore, the introduction of the American treasure hunters, led by Dr. Chamberlain, serves a vital narrative function beyond providing initial comic relief and a convenient group of sacrificial lambs. They embody the very greed and profane modern sensationalism that the ancient world, embodied by Ardeth Bay and the curse itself, inherently despises. They seek treasure for monetary gain, while Evelyn seeks knowledge for its own sake, and O'Connell seeks to survive the mess created by both motivations. This ethical contrast reinforces the film's underlying message. True discovery requires respect, not avarice, for the secrets of the past. The horrific fates met by the greedy hunters serve as immediate cautionary tales about hubris when dealing with forces beyond mortal comprehension. The film's masterful use of practical location shooting in Morocco lends an unmistakable texture to the adventure that subsequent CGI-heavy blockbusters often fail to replicate. The heat, the dust, and the claustrophobia of the narrow passageways in the fictional city of Hamunaptra feel genuinely oppressive. This lived-in quality enhances the audience's empathy for the protagonist's struggle. They are visibly exhausted, sweaty, and covered in grit, making their moments of heroism feel earned rather than choreographed. This commitment to tangible environment grounds the magic, ensuring that even when Imhotep's minions are attacking, the immediate danger, a collapsing tunnel or a sudden sandstorm, remains intensely real. Oded Fehr's Ardeth Bay, the Medjay protector, is far more than a convenient guide. He is the living conscience of ancient Egypt within the narrative. His quiet intensity and profound sense of duty provide a stark contrast to the manic energy of the Western intruders. Fair's limited dialogue forces the audience to read his judgment in his posture and his eyes. He represents a tradition and a commitment that transcends the temporary concerns of treasure hunting or even immediate survival, suggesting a deeper, cyclical struggle between order and chaos that the main characters stumble into. His occasional dry commentary on the idiocy of the outsiders often lands with the weight of centuries of failed human attempts to tame the supernatural. The romantic chemistry between Fraser and Weisz is not built on grand speeches, but on shared trauma and mutual reliance in crisis. Rick's admiration for Evelyn hardens into devotion when he sees her intellectual bravery under fire. She is the only person who can read the map out of the hell they have entered. Conversely, Evelyn's initial exasperation with O'Connell's blunt pragmatism slowly melts into respect as she witnesses his unflinching loyalty and natural proficiency in combat, a set of skills she desperately needs, but entirely lacks. Their exchanges are quick, often punctuated by explosions or fleeing from the undead, ensuring that their growing affection is integrated seamlessly into the high-stakes action, never slowing the momentum for extended expositional courtship. The visual motif of sand is crucial to Imhotep's presence. When he is weak, he is a dusty wraith. As he consumes life, the sand seems to coalesce around him, becoming solid, formidable, and terrifyingly powerful. This reliance on a single, elementally significant visual effect ties directly into the Egyptian setting, making Imhotep feel intrinsically bound to the very landscape the adventurers are traversing. When he finally reforms into a fully physical entity, the impact is enormous because the audience has witnessed his slow, agonizing reassembly from dust, making his complete form the apex of the film's visual effects ambition at the time. It is the ultimate payoff for the mythology established early on. The genius of Sommer's execution lies in never letting the audience forget that the threat is rooted in human folly and forbidden desire, rather than mere monster-of-the-week mechanics. Imhotep's resurrection is inextricably linked to Ankh-Sunamun, and the flashbacks, though brief, paint a picture of passionate transgression that elevates the villain beyond a simple undead brute. Arnold Vosloo masterfully conveys this yearning. Even in his monstrous forms, there is a drive that is recognizably human, albeit twisted by millennia of damnation. This tragedy fuels his escalating violence. He doesn't just want to rule the world, he wants to reclaim his lost love, making Evelyn, who shares Ankh-Sunamun's appearance, the unwitting focus of his renewed lust and rage. The secondary conflict involving the American treasure hunters, particularly the wealthy and oblivious Benny, serves as a necessary foil to the protagonist's developing sense of responsibility. These characters represent the worst instincts of Western colonialism and commercialism applied to ancient sites. They see ruins only as vaults of monetary value. Their immediate, greedy interaction with the treasures of Hamunaptra directly triggers the curses, highlighting the film's subtle moralizing. Knowledge and history demand reverence, not exploitation. Their gruesome, often comical demises serve as swift moral correction, reinforcing the idea that only those who respect the lore, like Evelyn and O'Connell eventually, can survive its perils. Furthermore, the supporting role of Dr. Alan Chamberlain, the expedition's official archaeologist and Evelyn's superior, functions as the embodiment of academic rigidity clashing with supernatural reality. He represents the established, cautious world of Egyptology that Evelyn is desperate to break free from. His disbelief and adherence to outdated theories make him an early casualty of Imhotep's power, illustrating that sometimes the inability to accept the impossible is a greater danger than the supernatural threat itself. His quick dispatch cleanses the narrative slate, allowing Evelyn to step fully into her role as the sole credible interpreter of the unfolding horror. The final confrontation, where O'Connell and Evelyn must use the living and dead versions of the Book of Thoth and the Book of the Dead, respectively, is a brilliantly orchestrated fusion of action and exposition. It requires O'Connell to engage in hand-to-hand combat against the fully materialized Imhotep, a visceral display of physical courage, while Evelyn simultaneously races against the clock to recite the counter-incantation. This simultaneous action ensures that both halves of the central partnership are indispensable to the climax. The emotional peak is not just defeating the mummy, but Evelyn mastering the terrifying knowledge she initially stumbled upon, reclaiming agency over the ancient forces she awakened. This resolution confirms that the film is ultimately about the harmonious integration of intellect and bravery. The film's genius also lies in its masterful deployment of escalating stakes through world-building that feels both vast and intimate. While the initial discovery is a contained affair within the hidden city, the reanimation of Imhotep immediately globalizes the conflict. The narrative swiftly transitions from dusty desert tombs to bustling Cairo streets, showing the direct, disruptive impact of the ancient curse on the modern world. This expansion is crucial. It grounds the supernatural threat in reality by showing its effects on contemporary society, the panic in the city, the inexplicable storms, and the threat to innocent civilians. It prevents Imhotep from remaining an isolated curiosity and transforms him into an active agent of global destruction. The comedic element, largely carried by John Hannah's Jonathan, operates as a necessary pressure release valve. Jonathan is the quintessential secondary character whose flaws, cowardice, avarice, and general ineptitude, become surprisingly endearing precisely because they are so human and relatable amidst the godlike powers unleashed by Imhotep. His desire to simply survive and perhaps grab a few trinkets while doing so provides a stark, grounded foil to Rick's world-weary heroism and Evelyn's high-minded intellectual pursuit. In many ways, Jonathan's constant state of panic mirrors the audience's own suppressed fear, allowing them a socially acceptable outlet for their terror. Jerry Goldsmith's score deserves repeated mention for its role in defining the film's identity. It's a score that understands the necessity of romanticism in adventure filmmaking. When the heroes ride across the dunes, the music swells with brass and soaring strings reminiscent of Korngold or Steiner, evoking the golden age of cinematic adventure. Yet when Imhotep approaches, the score descends into low, unsettling percussion and dissonant strings, utilizing ancient-sounding instrumentation to signal the presence of something truly alien to the modern era. This musical duality ensures that the film constantly toggles between thrilling escapism and genuine menace, keeping the emotional tone rich and varied. The visual realization of the plagues deserves further commentary because of its lasting impact. Unlike later horror films that favored hyperrealistic gore, The Mummy employs a more stylized, almost mythic depiction of horror. The flesh-eating scarabs, for example, are terrifying not just because they consume flesh, but because they swarm with terrifying, unnatural coordination, reflecting Imhotep's command over life itself. This stylized horror ensures the film retains its PG-13 accessibility while maximizing the visceral reaction. It's scary because it's impossible, not just because it's gory. The film successfully argues that spectacle can coexist with well-defined classical narrative structure, a balance few subsequent action adventures have managed to sustain so effectively. The narrative's insistence on the cyclical nature of history and the consequences of hubris is subtly reinforced through the visual design of the artifacts themselves. The scrolls and tablets Evelyn handles are not merely plot devices, they are depicted with ornate, unsettling detail, suggesting a tangible, weighty power that mere modern science cannot comprehend. When the Book of the Dead is opened, the script itself seems to writhe, emphasizing that these are not inert texts, but conduits for immense spiritual energy. This visual language elevates the scholarly aspect of Evelyn's journey. She is not just translating words, she is wrestling with primordial forces through language itself. Her gradual loss of academic composure as the severity of the situation becomes apparent mirrors a common struggle in classic adventure tales, the confrontation between man's limited understanding and the infinite power of the unknown. Rick O'Connell's transition from cynical survivor to committed protector is constantly tested by situations where physical bravery alone is insufficient. His moments of vulnerability often occur when he is forced to rely entirely on Evelyn's translation skills. There is a brief but telling scene where he admits his limitations regarding the ancient language, signaling a mutual respect for domains outside their immediate expertise. Fraser plays this reliance not as weakness, but as a necessary adaptation, showcasing a maturing sense of partnership. His rugged demeanor softens marginally only when Evelyn is directly threatened, demonstrating that his core motivation has shifted from self-preservation to safeguarding the person who represents both his greatest challenge and his most significant human connection. The character of Dr. Chamberlain, though quickly dispatched, serves a crucial thematic role as the embodiment of intellectual arrogance untempered by wisdom. His dismissal of the Magi warnings and his insistence on proceeding based on preconceived, flawed academic notions directly leads to the disaster. His demise is one of the film's earliest clear messages. The past does not yield its secrets to the dismissive or the purely commercially motivated. This contrasts sharply with Evelyn, whose initial mistake stems from an excess of enthusiasm, a desire to know, rather than outright contempt for the lore. The visual spectacle of Imhotep's pursuit is enhanced by the deliberate use of low-angle shots, particularly when he is first traversing the chambers as a sand wraith. This cinematography makes the towering figure feel impossibly large and overwhelmingly powerful, despite his lack of solid form. It establishes a visual hierarchy where Imhotep exists on a plane superior to the human adventurers. Only when he fully reforms, through consuming life force, does he become susceptible to conventional weaponry, marking a crucial turning point where human action is once again relevant against the supernatural. This carefully managed visibility, sometimes spectral, sometimes solid, keeps the audience guessing about his immediate vulnerabilities and sustains the tension of his presence throughout the middle act. The sheer sense of romantic adventure permeating the film is largely attributable to Stephen Sommers' directorial philosophy, which embraced the B-movie aesthetic of earlier eras while utilizing cutting-edge, for 1999 visual effects to deliver spectacle on an A-list budget. This approach allowed for moments of pure, unadulterated cinematic joy, such as the initial raft escape from the collapsing tomb, that felt deeply indebted to the likes of Raiders of the Lost Ark, yet still possessed their own kinetic energy. The film never pretends to be a gritty historical drama. It is an overt celebration of pulp storytelling, where the laws of physics and historical accuracy are happily suspended in favor of momentum and fun. This conscious decision to prioritize entertainment over rigid adherence to realism is what allows the supernatural elements to feel thrilling rather than jarringly out of place. Rachel Weisz's Evelyn is the necessary intellectual anchor, but her inherent clumsiness provides vital physical comedy that balances Rick's stoicism. Her frequent mishaps, tripping over artifacts, accidentally unleashing horrors, are not framed as inherent stupidity, but as the inevitable side effect of being so utterly absorbed in the thrill of historical investigation. This imperfection makes her eventual mastery of the ancient texts far more satisfying. She embodies the idea that true knowledge often requires risk, and that even the most careful scholar can become tangled in the consequences of their curiosity. Her fierce protection of her brother, even when he is being entirely useless, adds a layer of relatable familial loyalty beneath the sweeping adventure narrative. The visual representation of the Egyptian henchmen, the ancient warriors that Imhotep commands, brilliantly avoids the uncanny valley by leaning into their spectral nature. They are clearly dead, animated by dark magic, and their movements possess a jerky, unnerving quality that suggests ropes and pulleys, even when digitally rendered. This aesthetic choice harkens back to stop-motion and older physical effects, giving them an aged, authentic horror feel that many contemporary digital armies lack. They function as extensions of Imhotep's curse, physical manifestations of the ancient retribution being visited upon the modern world. The emotional core of the final confrontation relies heavily on the successful convergence of Rick's physicality and Evelyn's linguistic prowess. When Evelyn is attempting to read the counterspell, the camera often cuts back to Rick engaged in a desperate, near-futile fight against the physically revived Imhotep. This cross-cutting heightens the desperation. Rick is buying time with his life, using sheer will and conventional arms against a being that commands elemental forces. This narrative structure ensures that neither protagonist is merely a sidekick. Rick's willingness to physically sacrifice himself validates Evelyn's intellectual efforts, making their victory a true shared accomplishment built on mutual respect for their very different skill sets. The film beautifully demonstrates that in the face of overwhelming, ancient evil, both courage and wisdom are equally potent weapons. The relationship between the Medjai, represented by Ardeth Bay, and the modern explorers functions as a crucial thematic counterpoint regarding stewardship of history. Ardeth Bay's lineage has a deep, almost spiritual investment in keeping the world safe from Imhotep. Their duty is eternal and deeply personal. This contrasts sharply with the American treasure hunters whose greed precipitates the crisis, and even with the initially more academic, though ultimately careless, approach of Evelyn and Jonathan. The Medjai perspective frames the entire endeavor not as a grand adventure or a historical recovery mission, but as the continuation of a sacred, millennia-long defense effort. Oded Fair's understated performance conveys the immense burden of this inherited responsibility, making his occasional interventions feel weighted with historical precedent rather than mere plot convenience. He is the silent guardian who understands the rules of the engagement better than anyone involved, yet is constrained by ancient prophecies about when and how he can intervene. Rick O'Connell's character arc involves a necessary shedding of his mercenary detachment. Initially, he operates purely on transactional terms. He helps Evelyn for money, or because his life depends on it. However, as the scope of the danger expands from a simple tomb raid gone wrong to a full-scale supernatural apocalypse threatening Cairo, his motivation organically shifts towards altruism, primarily driven by his deepening feelings for Evelyn and his burgeoning responsibility for Jonathan. Fraser portrays this shift subtly. His protective actions become less about self-preservation and more about actively shielding the people he has come to care for from forces he cannot shoot. This evolution gives his character the necessary emotional depth to carry the weight of being the primary physical hero. The climax's reliance on the power of language, the spoken word, to undo the evil unleashed by the spoken word, is a sophisticated thematic touch often overlooked in action spectacles. Evelyn doesn't defeat Imhotep with a stronger weapon. She defeats him by correctly reading and reciting the precise incantation that reverses the curse. This places intellectual mastery at the pinnacle of power, confirming that knowledge, correctly applied, is ultimately superior to brute force or unchecked magic. The danger of the ancient texts is balanced by the salvation offered by their mastery, reinforcing Evelyn's central importance to the narrative resolution in a way few female leads in this genre managed at the time. Even the visual representation of Imhotep's ultimate dissolution feels thematically appropriate. As he is sent back to oblivion, he doesn't explode or vanish in a puff of smoke. He crumbles back into dry, inert sand, returning to the dust from which he was violently assembled. This final act visually reinforces the film's central tension between ephemeral human ambition and the eternal, unyielding nature of the earth and its ancient forces. The adventure concludes not with a celebration of conquest, but with the successful restoration of a fragile, ancient order, leaving the heroes wiser, chastened, and bonded by shared survival against forces that view human life as utterly disposable. The film's success in balancing reverence for its source material, the classic Universal monster pictures, with the demands of a late 90s blockbuster, is rooted in its playful yet respectful handling of Egyptian iconography. Everything from the costume design to the set decoration is steeped in a sense of historical awe, making the subsequent desecration by the treasure hunters feel like a genuine violation rather than just a necessary plot trigger. This commitment to visual authenticity, even when overlaid with high fantasy action, lends a satisfying gravitas to the proceedings. The Egyptian mythology is treated as a real, functional system of magic, not merely a backdrop for action sequences, which forces the characters, and by extension the audience, to approach the environment with a cautious respect. Brendan Fraser's performance as Rick O'Connell consistently benefits from his ability to project an everyman quality, even when faced with impossible odds. He is the perfect anchor for the audience's skepticism. When he expresses disbelief or resorts to pragmatic violence, it feels like a natural reaction to an absurd situation. His arc is fundamentally about finding something worth protecting beyond mere gold. The quiet moments where he observes Evelyn's passion, initially with annoyance, gradually morph into admiration for her sheer intellectual bravery. This transition is key to making their eventual bond feel earned. He admires what he cannot emulate, and she learns to rely on his capacity for decisive action when her knowledge proves insufficient. Rachel Weisz as Evelyn expertly navigates the fine line between historical enthusiast and accidental catalyst of global doom. Her character's initial moments are dominated by physical comedy, stemming from her over-eagerness, knocking over priceless artifacts or stumbling into danger, but these moments never undermine her intelligence. Instead, they emphasize the inherent risk involved in tampering with forces one doesn't fully comprehend. Her eventual triumph is intellectual. She deciphers the solution not through luck, but through dedicated scholarship applied under extreme duress. This makes her arguably the most proactive hero in the story, as the physical prowess of Rick is nullified without her deciphering ability in the final act. The dynamic created by the ensemble is finely tuned for episodic adventure structure. Jonathan Carnahan, the comic relief, often provides moments of grounding absurdity, highlighting how ludicrous the situation appears from an outside perspective. His bumbling survival instincts are necessary to deflate the seriousness just enough before the next major scare. Meanwhile, the Medjay, personified by Ardeth Bey, serve as the solemn mythological chorus, constantly reminding the audience that this is not simply a treasure hunt but an ancient battle being fought on modern ground. Their unified presence ensures the fantasy elements never feel entirely unmoored from their supposed historical and mystical origins, maintaining a coherent, if thrillingly exaggerated, internal logic. The narrative's construction skillfully uses claustrophobia and disorientation to amplify the protagonist's terror, particularly within the labyrinthine passages of the buried city. As the group delves deeper, the environment itself becomes a hostile character, actively working against their navigation. The flickering torchlight and deep shadows play tricks on the eye, mirroring the characters' fraying nerves and creating a constant sense of being watched by unseen entities. This deliberate manipulation of light and space keeps the audience perpetually off balance, ensuring that even moments of relative quiet are charged with latent threat. The grime and decay are not just cosmetic details, they represent the suffocating weight of time and the accumulated malevolent energy of the resting place. O'Connell's gruff exterior is consistently challenged by the supernatural absurdity he faces. His reliance on his military training and his trusty sidearm proves increasingly futile against an enemy that regenerates from dust and commands legions of the dead. This highlights a crucial theme: the limits of modern, tangible solutions when confronted by ancient, metaphysical power. Fraser expertly conveys a growing weariness that goes beyond physical exhaustion. It's the existential fatigue of a pragmatic man forced to accept a reality where his skills are secondary to the esoteric knowledge held by the woman beside him. His steadfastness, however, when he positions himself between Evelyn and a direct threat, speaks volumes about his evolving commitment, transforming his mercenary engagement into something akin to knightly protection. Evelyn's intellectual passion borders on obsession, a trait that Summers frames as both her greatest strength and her most dangerous flaw. When she reads the Book of the Dead, her expression is one of intense, almost ecstatic intellectual fervor, momentarily eclipsing any rational fear of consequence. This hubris is immediately punished, demonstrating the film's cautionary stance on unlocking secrets without respect. Yet, her ability to pivot from being the cause of the chaos to the sole source of salvation provides a compelling character arc. Her terror when facing Imhotep is palpable, but it is always underpinned by the analytical mind working furiously to identify the pattern, the weakness, the linguistic key to undoing the disaster she initiated. Ardeth Bey remains the embodiment of unwavering commitment, a necessary moral compass in a landscape corrupted by greed and restless evil. Oded Fehr's performance is defined by restraint. His silences often carry more narrative weight than pages of dialogue. He views the adventurers with a mix of detached disapproval and grim obligation, aware that their recklessness has awakened a force his people have dedicated centuries to keeping dormant. His presence grounds the film's fantastical elements by providing the mythology with a living, dedicated guardian, reinforcing the idea that the struggle against Imhotep is not a modern problem, but a timeless, cosmic negotiation between order and chaos. His commitment is pure duty, setting a standard against which the flawed but ultimately good intentions of the main trio are measured. The seamless integration of practical effects and early CGI allows the plagues to possess a tangible, almost disgusting texture that modern, overly smoothed digital effects often miss. The water deluge, for instance, is not just a massive wave. It is a churning, overwhelming force that carries the recognizable debris of the modern world, floating wreckage, splintered wood, making the ancient curse feel like it is physically drowning the 20th century. This fusion ensures that even the most fantastical moments are felt in the gut. When the flesh-eating scarabs swarm, the sound design emphasizes the clicking and gnawing, a high-frequency auditory assault that makes the skin crawl, focusing the horror on the violation of physical integrity rather than just overwhelming visual spectacle. Jonathan Carnahan's cowardice is continually juxtaposed against the sheer, unearned confidence of the villain. Benny, the opportunistic guide who switches allegiance the moment the true power of Imhotep is revealed, serves as the perfect pathetic mirror to Jonathan. While Jonathan is motivated by self-preservation and familial ties, however often he complains about them, Benny is motivated purely by the promise of earthly reward and power, a temptation that ultimately proves fatal. His sniveling terror and quick betrayal underscore the moral differences within the imperfect characters. Jonathan is flawed but loyal, while Benny is simply corruptible. Evelyn's intellectual drive, while saving them all, carries a heavy undercurrent of guilt that colors her interactions post-awakening. Her initial excitement over discovery turns into grim determination. When she handles the texts now, there is a noticeable tremor in her hands that wasn't there before, a physical manifestation of the knowledge that her actions have consequence on a global scale. Her desperation to find the counterspell is driven by a need for atonement. She recognizes that the boundary between academic curiosity and cosmic vandalism has been irrevocably blurred by her own hands. This internal conflict elevates her from a capable scholar to a tragically responsible heroine. The enduring tension between Rick and Ardeth Bey is a subtle but effective source of conflict. Rick sees Ardeth as an obstacle, a superstitious local interfering with a pragmatic recovery operation, while Ardeth views Rick as another reckless outsider whose greed might doom them all. Their grudging respect develops only through shared combat experience. When Rick places himself in harm's way to defend Evelyn, Ardeth sees not a hired gun, but a man capable of selfless action. the very trait expected of the Magi oath. This non-verbal acknowledgement of shared bravery, often exchanged over the din of battle, solidifies their alliance far more effectively than any dialogue could. The film thus uses its secondary characters to constantly interrogate and define the heroism of its central figures. Hello everyone, and welcome to the territory of cinema. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Today we are going to discuss the movie The Mummy from 1999. The desert sun beat down on the dusty plains of Egypt, a fitting backdrop for the adventure that was about to unfold. We find Rick O'Connell, a man whose past is as rugged as the terrain he navigates, an American serving in the French Foreign Legion whose fortunes have recently taken a decidedly downward turn after a rather disastrous military engagement. He finds himself in a Cairo jail, a situation one might expect for someone with his particular knack for causing trouble. Yet it is here he meets Evelyn Carnahan. Evelyn, a bright but somewhat clumsy librarian with an almost obsessive passion for Egyptology, is clearly not cut out for the life of adventure she dreams of, though her knowledge is undeniable. Her ambition is tied to her brother, Jonathan, a cheerfully unreliable sort who seems to profit mostly from his sister's endeavors. Evelyn, driven by the desire to prove her theories about the lost city of Hamunaptra, the city of the dead, manages to secure funding and Rick's release, essentially trading his freedom for his services as a guide into the unforgiving sands. Their expedition is fraught with immediate peril. The desert seems determined to swallow them whole, but the allure of the ancient secrets is too strong. They eventually locate the hidden entrance to Hamunaptra, a feat that speaks volumes of Evelyn's research prowess, even if her execution remains delightfully chaotic. Inside the ruins, the team unwittingly awakens something truly ancient and terrible. While exploring the sarcophagus chamber, Evelyn, in typical fashion, reads aloud from a forbidden text, the Book of the Dead. This act instantly unleashes Imhotep, the high priest who betrayed the pharaoh centuries ago, cursed to eternal undeath. Imhotep, once a powerful figure under Seti I, had dared to love Anck-su-namun, the pharaoh's mistress, leading to his gruesome mutilation and entombment alive. Now, resurrected, he seeks to bring Anck-su-namun back to life, absorbing the life force of those around him, including Evelyn, whom he instinctively recognizes as the reincarnation of his lost love. As Imhotep gathers strength, Egypt itself begins to bleed. Plagues sweep across the land. Locusts, the Nile turning to blood, storms that defy nature's logic. Rick, ever the pragmatist, finds himself caught between protecting Evelyn, who feels deeply responsible for the catastrophe, and surviving the growing army of the walking dead Imhotep commands. The tension is palpable. Rick's survival instincts clash with Evelyn's scholarly duty to right her wrong. Jonathan, for his part, mainly tries to avoid getting killed while keeping an eye out for any treasure he can claim along the way. The pursuit takes them across Egypt, pursued by both Imhotep's minions and the surviving members of Evelyn's initial financial backers, who are less interested in preserving history and more interested in securing the gold they believe is buried there. Rick, whose prior service shows a commendable ability to organize and lead under fire, proves an invaluable protector. He and Evelyn develop a genuine fiery chemistry amidst the chaos, their differing worldviews slowly meshing as they face death repeatedly. They realize that the only way to stop the high priest is to use the Book of the Living hidden within Evelyn's inheritance, which can effectively reverse the curse and re-entomb Imhotep. The climax returns them to Hamunaptra, where Imhotep has nearly completed his ritual, his power nearly absolute. Rick fights a desperate battle against the undead high priest, while Evelyn races against time to read the counterspell. Jonathan, surprisingly, plays a crucial role in distracting one of the mummy guards. In a final, breathless sequence, Evelyn successfully reads the necessary incantations. Imhotep crumbles back into dust, the curse broken, and Ankh-Sunamun's desiccated remains finally find peace. With the danger past and the riches of Hamunaptra secured, though mostly for the museums, much to Jonathan's chagrin, Rick and Evelyn step out of the tomb, forever bound by the extraordinary events they shared. They leave Egypt behind, perhaps ready for a life that involves slightly less desecration of ancient tombs, though knowing their dynamic, one suspects this grand adventure is just the beginning. The setting was electric with the scent of dry earth and ancient dust, a potent perfume for two souls so mismatched yet so inextricably linked by fate. Rick O'Connell, whose service in the Legion had etched a permanent weariness around his eyes, a look that suggested he'd seen far too many sunrises over battlefields, was a man built for reaction, his every move honed by necessity. He carried himself with a coiled readiness, a stark contrast to Evelyn Carnahan, whose excitement often manifested as physical awkwardness, tripping over invaluable artifacts in her eagerness to catalog them. Her intellect, however, was a gleaming, sharp thing, capable of deciphering hieroglyphs that had baffled established scholars for decades. Jonathan, meanwhile, was pure comic relief, wrapped in slightly ill-fitting tweed, perpetually maneuvering for a better share of the spoils, yet possessing a surprising, if opportunistic, loyalty when genuine danger presented itself. Their initial foray into the ruins was a masterclass in controlled demolition, courtesy of Rick's wartime experience, constantly having to secure areas Evelyn's zeal endangered. The discovery of the hidden chambers felt monumental, a moment where Evelyn's belief in the obscure texts she cherished was vindicated, even as the air grew heavy with a dread she couldn't articulate. When the parchment of the Book of the Dead slipped from her grasp, the sound of its unrolling seemed louder than any desert wind, immediately triggering the dreadful transformation of their petty thieves' escort into shambling horrors. Imhotep's reawakening was less a resurrection, and more an oozing, ancient power asserting itself, his initial appearance as a desiccated husk quickly transitioning to a form of formidable, supernatural malice once he consumed the first life force. The plagues that followed were terrifyingly literal interpretations of biblical warnings, turning the vibrant marketplaces of Cairo into scenes of biblical horror. Watching the Nile bleed crimson under a sky thick with unnatural storms brought home the magnitude of Evelyn's mistake. Her academic curiosity had inadvertently unleashed a force of primordial vengeance. Rick found himself in a role he perhaps secretly craved, the protector of innocence against overwhelming darkness. His easy familiarity with firearms and strategic retreat contrasted sharply with Evelyn's instinct to analyze the mummy's movements as if they were complicated footnotes. There was an undeniable spark ignited by shared peril. Rick admired her sheer tenacity, the way she refused to shrink from the monster she'd helped create, while Evelyn saw past the Legionnaire's cynicism to the core of genuine, if reluctant, heroism. As they fought their way across the landscape, dodging the flesh-hungry servants of the priest, former soldiers and villagers animated by dark magic, the pursuit became a desperate scramble for knowledge. Evelyn's recollection of the Book of the Living, a text she'd initially dismissed as mythology, became their only lifeline. The stakes were personal for her. She was not merely saving Egypt, but redeeming herself. Rick's calm under pressure, skills honed in conflicts far removed from ancient curses, kept their small band alive through ambush after ambush. Jonathan, ever the opportunist, played a key role in securing transport or supplies, usually by abandoning someone else momentarily, but always reappearing when the escape seemed impossible. The final confrontation was inevitably back where it all began, in the suffocating darkness of Hamunaptra. Imhotep, now nearly fully restored by consuming the life force of those who had previously sought the city's treasures, stood as a monumental threat, radiating an aura of impossible power. The climax was a desperate symphony of action and incantation. Rick engaged Imhotep in a brutal physical exchange, relying on sheer grit and his understanding of modern weaponry against supernatural durability, buying Evelyn the vital seconds she needed. Evelyn, clutching the Book of the Living, her voice wavering not from fear, but from the immense concentration required to read the complex counter-magical language, finally managed to voice the final words. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the high priest. As Imhotep dissolved into ash, the air seemed to cleanse itself of centuries of foul magic. The desiccated corpse of Anck-su-namun, finally released from the enchantment, simply turned to dust beside him, a tragic footnote resolved. Emerging into the dawn, the three of them, the weary soldier, the brilliant scholar, and the self-serving brother, were irrevocably changed, survivors of an age-old conflict, their shared secret binding them tighter than any romantic declaration. They carried away not just the promise of historical preservation, but the undeniable proof that some stories are best left unread. The Egyptian dawn, when they finally stumbled back into it, felt blindingly pure after the suffocating gloom of the tomb. Rick, wiping the grit and sweat from his face, carried the unmistakable aura of a man who had just wrestled with something fundamentally outside the laws of physics and won purely through stubbornness and well-aimed bullets. The exhaustion etched onto his frame was testament to a career spent constantly anticipating the next threat, whether it came from a firing squad or an enraged mummy. For Evelyn, emerging felt like an exorcism. The weight of the catastrophic mistake she'd made, the reading of the curse, was slowly lifting, replaced by the profound satisfaction of having corrected an error of cosmic proportions. Her posture straightened, the timid academic veneer finally cracking to reveal the determined explorer underneath, capable of facing down death armed with only a book. Jonathan, ever concerned with the practicalities of survival, was already haggling with the few remaining guards, trying to secure a fair price for their passage out of the dangerous vicinity, his moral compass perpetually spinning toward profit. He had, surprisingly, managed to keep the priceless artifacts relatively safe, mostly because he was too terrified of Imhotep to get near them until the danger had definitively passed. His momentary bravery in distracting a pursuing undead warrior near the central pillar was quickly filed away under lucky accidents in his personal ledger. The bond forged between Rick and Evelyn deepened in the silence that followed the collapse of the ancient evil. It was a connection built not on polite conversation or shared hobbies, but on the visceral reality of saving each other's lives multiple times within a 24-hour period. Rick looked at Evelyn not just as the cause of the disaster, but as the only person capable of wielding the esoteric knowledge necessary to end it. He saw the steel beneath the librarian's spectacles. Conversely, Evelyn saw the quiet nobility in Rick, the man who fought not for glory or gold, but because someone needed protecting. His cynicism, she realized, was merely scar tissue protecting a fierce sense of responsibility. As they rode away from the now-sealed necropolis, the desert landscape seemed suddenly less menacing, imbued with the knowledge that its secrets, though dangerous, were now safely contained. The lingering fear was replaced by a shared, almost giddy disbelief. They had faced the impossible. Rick, leaning back, the familiar weight of his sidearm a comfort, found himself anticipating a future that included less Legion duty and perhaps more of Evelyn's lively, if chaotic, company. He realized the pursuit of history, guided by Evelyn, might be more compelling than